The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
What I'd love to tell about is the very first time after that day-long conference when I went to a new story group that had just recently started at the Scotia Library called the Story Circle. Not sure it was of the Capital Region at that point yet, but definitely Story Circle. And I went to a little upstairs room in the Scotia Library. I'll never forget it. It's just so cozy and quiet, and there were probably 7 or 8 people from the area that already called themselves storytellers, and I thought, well, I'll just go and listen. But Janine Laverty, who'd been that keynote speaker and concert giver, really, just weeks before in Oneonta, she was telling, other people were telling, and finally, everybody had told except me. And I was only there to listen, which is something we all know if you give workshops. Oh, no, I just came to listen. But she said to me, well, we still have time, so why don't you tell us something that you read every year to your students? And I said, well, I'm in middle school, so I don't tend to read alouds quite in the same way, or don't have favorites that I would read every year. Although there's a poem I know, a long narrative poem, and I don't know it by heart, called The Mountain Whippoorwill by Stephen Vincent Benet. And Janine said, well, is it a story? Does it tell a story? I said, oh, yes, it very much tells a story about a boy who went to a fiddling contest down in Georgia. She said, all right, go back to the beginning. How do you see the boy in the beginning of the story? What's he like? What happens when he goes to the fiddling contest? And I'll tell you, my stomach was in knots. I said, oh, Stephen Vincent Benet would roll over in his grave to think that I'm just going to tell it like a story. She said, oh, I think his spirit would love you telling it like a story, because it was a story. So I began. And I won't do the whole poem for you now, although I've gone back and committed most of it to memory. But I had to enter the story in a way I never had, though my students and I had for years read it aloud. There were solo voices and dark voices and light voices. But I had to say, up in the mountains, and I did remember the beginning, it's lonesome all the time. Soft wind slewing through the sweet potato vine. Up in the mountains, it's lonesome for a child. Whippoorwills a-callin' when the sap runs wild. Up in the mountains in the fog, why everything's as lazy as an old howling dog. And then I couldn't remember the words anymore, and I was so terrified. But she just looked at me like, go ahead, just tell us the story. She didn't say a word, she just encouraged me. And that kind of encouragement has stayed with me and stayed with the way I teach storytelling the rest of my life. What I did was I had to picture the boy getting to the big fair in Georgia where he slapped a silver dollar and said, there's my calling card, and anyone that licks me will have to fiddle hard. And I knew that line, I loved that line, but then I had to go back into seeing the big fiddlers laughing, slapping their knees, somebody saying, there's one dead dollar. And find my way through the boy losing his confidence as he saw fiddler after fiddler get tons of applause. And he said to himself, whippoorwill, that was what he called his fiddle, you can sing no more. And he thought about just getting up and leaving. But he said, nah, I was alone where I was raised, and this audience isn't going to get me fazed. And he stepped in and he picked up his fiddle and he thought about the squirrels in the mountains where he'd grown up, those images, the memories, you know. He thought about God lying sleeping in his big white beard, you know, his image. And then he went through actually country images and Bible images and so many things, and that's the way he played. And I could do that part pretty well. And finally at the end, when he stopped strumming, there wasn't a sound. I thought, I fiddled all night and lost. You're a good hillbilly, but you've been bossed. So the boy went to congratulate Old Man Dan, the best of the fiddlers, and he put his fiddle into the boy's hand. And then the noise of the crowd began. And that's the way Stephen Vincent Benet finishes the poem. And I learned, oh my gosh, I got all the way through that story. And you still, and I knew it from doing it with the kids, you have to stop for a minute because the audience is also in awe listening to the story. And then they kind of come out of that trance and are ready to applaud. And it taught me you have to enter the story. You have to get in there. You have to feel it, face it, whatever's in there, and face how much of it in some ways about yourself. I'd grown up with a lot of competition. and I learned that poem in the 9th grade and thought, I think this is a stupid poem because I was in a little drama class, like a Southern boy. What's it have nothing to do with me? But of course, I've been teaching it for about 10 years to my students, and I realized how much it had to do with me.
It was Christmas Day at the Pine Street Inn, the oldest and largest homeless shelter in Boston. And I was there to serve dinner for the 3rd year in a row. And I was standing inside the doorway of the kitchen holding a large pan of mashed potatoes, waiting for the prayer, because the prayer was my signal to step into the dining room. And this is what I heard. And so on this Christmas Day, I invite you to look inside yourself. And if you like what you see, then dance with it. But if you don't, then I invite you to learn some new steps. And once you have done that, I invite you to look at the world around you. And if you like what you see, well, then dance with it. But if you don't like what you see, well then, I invite you to teach the world some new steps. I was floored. This was not the prayer I was used to. Normally, prayers at the Pine Street Inn on Christmas Day were kind of drive-by blessings by religious luminaries from greater Boston. And you could tell by the way they were dressed, they barely took off their coats, and they were definitely on their way from some very nice religious place to some place much nicer than the place that we were standing at that moment, which was terrazzo floored and tile-walled with grills on the windows and dreadful fluorescent lighting. But this guy, this man who delivered that prayer was not like those people. I could see him at the other end of this long table with probably 70 people total, 35 on each side. And he was dressed in a camel's hair coat with a scarf wrapped twice around his neck, and he was tall and slender with beautiful silver hair that swept back from his forehead and just touched the top of that scarf. His voice was deep and sonorous and patrician, and I was blown away, not only by what he said, but how it made me feel inside. But I didn't have time to really think about what he said because I had to serve dinner, and so I started. And by the time I was done, and we had taken all of the hot food and cold drinks to everybody at the table, it was time to start clearing. And so we did that, and then it was time to take warm pie and hot coffee to everybody. And by the time that was done, it was time to start clearing again. And I really wanted to thank him. I was so surprised when he didn't leave. He actually sat at the end of the table and started talking to the men on either side of him. I'd never seen anybody do that before. Well, finally, at the end of the meal, all the men rose, and they went to go into the next room where they got their Christmas presents, which were socks and underwear and gum and candy for folks who didn't smoke and cigarettes for those who did. Pine Street Inn was not judgy about that kind of thing. And so I put down the pile of plates I had, and I zoomed up to the end of the table where he was, and I touched him on the shoulder. And when he turned around, I stuck out my hand, and I said, I just want to thank you so much for what you said. That was an incredible prayer. It just made me think about things a lot, you know? And he took my hand in both of his, and he shook it. And he looked at me, and he smiled kind of sadly, and he said, well, thank you. I hope it helps. And at that moment, I realized that the two hands that were holding mine were grimy in the creases. His nails were broken. And that camel's hair coat that had looked so good at a remove was actually stained and worn, as was the scarf around his neck. And his hair touched his scarf not out of a fashion statement, but because it needed a haircut, and he was not very well shaven, and he smelled terrible. And I realized that I had just gotten an incredible blessing, a blessing that had mattered so much to me from a homeless man. As he walked off, I turned around and picked up the dishes and tried to wrap my head around this. I come from a do-goody kind of family. We do charity work. We give money to charity. We volunteer for things. I'd certainly seen my mother and my grandmother give money to homeless folks before. But I had always somehow seen it as a from us to them. I had never understood that this was a mutual kind of agreement. And I had certainly never felt like they were going to have something to give me, even though on at least one occasion when I was younger, I'd been saved from a terrible disaster by two homeless guys and a couple of sex workers. But even that had seemed accidental. This was something that pulled me up short. And so that night I drove home, and as I walked into the house for dinner, I smelled this incredible meal that my husband and his two best friends were cooking, and I sat at the table and we ate, and we drank wine, and we laughed. And I thought, I'm looking inside myself, and I don't know that I entirely like what I see. I wasn't quite sure what those new steps were going to be. So fast forward a number of years, I don't know, 4 or 5 or so, and I'm back at the Pine Street Inn on Christmas Day, and it is really cold, the kind of cold that we had here recently, that below zero kind of cold. And normally we'd feed maybe 200 people, maybe 170, but we were on our third seating of 100. And most of the volunteers had to leave, but I didn't, because I had my husband and his best friends at home cooking for me. So I said I would stay, and 3 of us were left to staff this one table. And so while we're running, warm food and hot coffee and cold drinks to people, I noticed there's 3 young men seated at one end of the table, my end. They're in their early 20s, and they're laughing, and they're having a great time. And so I made sure they got seconds, because it was definitely our last seating. We'd already packed up all the food for the van we were going to. And then when it came to pie, we had lots of pie left. And so I gave them seconds at the first seating. And then I had more pie. So I went over. And instead of asking them if they wanted more, I slid into a chair next to them. And I said, so where are you from? They looked at me kind of surprised. And then 2 of them said in concert, from Queens. I said, Queens, where? Well, Bayside. Where in Bayside? 125th Street. Well, I grew up in the corner of Valley Pine Park, and where'd you go to school? And we proceeded to have the kind of conversation that I, and probably you, and I'm sure you, have had with people in subways and trains and airports and new neighbors and colleagues. The kind of conversation you have with anybody that I didn't know you could have with homeless people. And so finally, they were kind of done, and I looked around and said, well, I better get back to work, or they're going to fire me, and everybody laughed, and I picked up the dishes, and I went back into the kitchen. And then I stepped into the dining room one more time to see if I'd forgotten anything. The 3 young men were standing at the end of the table, and one of them beckoned me over. And when I got there, he said, we want to give you something. And I thought inside myself, You can't give me a present. I mean, you're homeless. What could you possibly have to give me? Besides, I should be giving you something. But I didn't say that. I said, thanks. And so this young man took a bag, maybe this wide, and this deep and this high, and he unrolled the top. And out of it, he took a beautiful crocheted scarf and he handed it to me. I looked at it and I shook it out and I wrapped it around my neck and I tied it. I thanked him again. And then I hugged all three of them. And they left and they went to get their Christmas presents. And on my way home that night, I thought about how incredibly lucky I was to be able to receive something in a way I thought wasn't possible.
The prompt was, what's the first time you made any money that you thought was a lot of money? A lot of money? Well, I could go for my first paycheck as a teacher, but no, another memory pushed its way through of when I was in the 4th grade, and the junior choir director in our church, who was also our music teacher in school, had asked me after choir practice one night, would you come at 7 in the morning and sing the Mass for the young priest, and then stay for 7:30 and sing the Mass for the pastor, and then I'll take you home to my house, and I'll get you some breakfast and get you back to school, Catholic school. It was Holy Family School in Fulton, New York, and we'll get you to school on time at 9 o'clock. I was like, oh, yeah, that would be great. So that was a memory, but the thing about the money was that right when I finished that first morning, the organist took me down into the church sacristy, a place where really just the priest and the altar boys would go. I thought she must have had a dispensation from the Pope or something for women to go in at that time. We're talking about 1961. And we walked in, and the priest said, oh, my pearl of a girl, which was a nickname that he had for me because my real name is Marguerite, and in his mind that was a word that meant pearl. So he said, I've got some insurance for you. And he gave me a $5 bill, brand new from the bank, really crisp, and said, but that's not just for today, that's so you'll keep coming. And I went home the happiest girl that day. I just felt smart, and it was great. And that $5 felt like the most money I had ever made. I think in our house we might have gotten a quarter for doing chores or things like that, but that $5 felt like a lot. So that was my story that I told in the workshop. But the week finished, and we'd had such wonderful performances by Jay, these long stories that he would write and enter the characters. I just learned so many things. And we'd even had a big workshop where everybody who wanted to could just stand up quick and tell a story about the 4th of July, because it had been the 4th of July weekend. And I had told a little story about my family celebrating the not 1776, but 1976, something like that. Some kind of big party we'd had with a cake that looked like a flag, and my aunts all sang barbershop quartet harmony, this is my country. So I had told that little story just very casually. But then, the end of the week, Rafe Martin stood in front of the last gathering of all the storytellers who had come, and there were a good 50, 60 people, I think. And he said, this is a story swap, a final story swap, but I'm challenging people not to tell a story that you're really good at, a story you think is, yeah, this is my best story. Because that's sort of showing off, and there's nothing wrong with that, but to learn, you want to push yourself ahead, push yourself forward. So I challenge you to tell a story that came up in you this week and see what it's like to tell it again in front of a fabulous listening audience. Storytellers are a really good listening audience, as you said before, Kate. I had no intention of being there and saying, oh, I've got one. I just sat there waiting for somebody to say, I'll go first. But my 10-year-old was sitting next to me, or 8, whatever he was, Brian. He took my hand, raised it in the air, and said, my mom will.
You gotta love a kid like that.
There was no turning back after that point. So I walked up on stage, and I started. And I basically took myself through the story as I had told it in the workshop, just a few minutes, and how the money was the thing that the story was about. But when I was on the stage, and I'm looking both at my son, my sister, several other tellers that I know well, I suddenly found myself saying, and boy, I went to the teacher's house for breakfast, and wow, we had this and this. And then next thing I know, I'm at school, and I feel like the smartest girl in the class. I'm raising my hand for every answer, even if I don't know it, just feeling like the right thing will come out my mouth. I was so high from being acknowledged that I had done well. And then in my classroom, my 4th grade classroom, there was a knock at our door. And part of my brain is telling the story. And part of my brain is saying, where is this story going, Marni? You are past the most important thing, which was the money. So what's going to be the most important thing in this version of it? And then suddenly I knew it was the knock at the door and the young priest, who was a very strict man, very different from the jolly old, oh, my pearl of a girl pastor. And he walked into our classroom, but I was still so high. I thought, he probably wants to call me out in the hall and give me some more compliments. 9 years old. I can't wait. And sure enough, he didn't look at me, but he spoke to the nun who was our teacher, and then he left. And then the teacher looked at me and said, Marguerite, Father would like to speak with you out in the hall. And something about the tone in her voice told me it wasn't necessarily going to be a compliment. But I stood up, and my friends are all going, tell us what he says, tell us what he says. And I'm like, hush, hush. And I walk out the door, and I look up. He was a very tall man in a long black cape. We often called him Dracula because of that cape. But I was there to talk with him. And I said, good morning, Father. And he looked down and said, Marguerite, you did well for a little girl this morning, but, and he paused, and I knew he was trying to find out another way to say, you didn't do well. And what he said was, but your voice as a child, it's simply not ripe yet. You know, like how apples get ripe, and that's when they're ready. And I knew about apples because we had an apple tree, and I knew about rotten apples, but there was nothing that was going to come out my mouth. I just kept looking at him. And he said, I want you to tell the organist you're not going to do this anymore. It was very inappropriate of her to ask a child to do this. She needs to get an adult, and there are many adult choir members that could do this. And all I knew how to say was, yes, Father. And I walked inside the classroom, and I sat down, and I didn't want to tell anybody about what he'd said. Now, at that point in telling the story, I knew I couldn't leave my audience sunk. I looked around, and everybody was sad and mad. And my sister had tears streaming down her face. And I realized she's not crying about me. She's crying about herself and times that someone has told her, she's a very good singer, that she wasn't good enough. And I just wrapped it up by saying, so I waited till I got home, and when my mom said, well, how did it go? I burst into tears, finally, tears that I had held inside all day long, because my brothers told me when I was young, don't be a crybaby in school. And I cried, and she said, all right, I will handle this. And it was like my mother was a bear, a mother bear. And she never told me how she fixed it, but she did. And after that, I was pretty soon singing every day, and I got to sing at weddings and funerals, and you make a lot of money when you do that. And that's the way I ended the story that day, and learned, wow, a lot about the art of storytelling.
Ruby and I had been on the road for close to 2.5 months. Actually, we'd been on the road for close to 1.5 years, but this particular segment, we'd been living in a tent in the mountains of Colorado above Durango for about 2 months. And suddenly, I wanted to come back east more than anything. And so I packed up my camping gear. The snow was about to fly in Colorado anyway, and we headed down the back of the Rockies and across Kansas, and found ourselves finally, at the end of quite a long drive, in Indiana, when I desperately just needed to walk. And so Ruby and I poured ourselves out of two sides of the car and began to walk. Ruby was my rescued Doberman Pinscher. And as we walked along, I reflected at how much she had changed in the year and some since I had rescued her. When I'd gotten her, she was emaciated and skinny and skittish, and she was missing hair, and she'd had scars all the way down her back and her sides, and her nails were broken, and so was her spirit. But as we walked through this little park, and I watched her walk next to me, I couldn't help but admire what she looked like, which was a fully muscled, glistening, dark red Doberman Pinscher who pranced on her little feet, but also marveled at her spirit, which had returned with a will and that she carried all around her. The park was beautiful. It was this long green sort of swath of lawn, and there was a little hill at the end and a copse of deciduous trees at the top that cast just enough shade I could imagine lying down and not doing anything for a while if we got that far. And there was a little stream that ran along this side and a sprinkling of trees over here. We walked along and I just concentrated on stretching. Ruby did the same, and I wasn't worried. She wasn't on a leash. She wasn't going to leave me. And she wandered a little bit further than usual, and every once in a while she'd stop and crop a little clump of green grass that was left in the late summer kind of brown grass. And every once in a while she'd flip over on her back and do that thing that dogs do when they're really happy. We got about halfway across this patch of grass, and I saw coming out of the trees at the top of that hill a little boy running straight down the hill. And he had blonde hair that was kind of flopping around his head, and he had on a little polo shirt and shorts and sneakers, and his little legs were kind of wheeling, and his arms were waving, and I could hear him yelling something, but I wasn't really sure what it was. And to be truthful, I didn't pay any attention to him because he wasn't my problem. And I kept walking. We went a little bit further, and I looked over, and Ruby was a little bit further than she usually was, but she looked at me, and I knew she knew where I was, and I wasn't worried. This time I was a little bit closer to the bottom of the hill, and I could hear the little boy. Bullfighter! Bullfighter! He was yelling, which wasn't anything I recognized, but he was blonde and fair with reddish cheeks, and I assumed it must be some sort of Eastern European language, maybe. But I didn't pay any attention to him because he wasn't my problem. And a little further along, I noticed a woman, very, very pregnant woman, coming out of the trees at the top of the hill, and she too was not so much running down the hill as making an effort not to tumble down it because her stomach was definitely way ahead of her. And she was yelling his name, which I could now hear. David! David, stop! I tracked David and realized he was on a straight collision course for my dog. Now, I have to tell you that Ruby loved children. She was incredible. She had passed a good canine citizenship test. She could be trusted with anybody, but I wasn't really sure what my big Doberman Pinscher would do in a collision course with a small 4 or 5-year-old child, so I began to run. Not much more gracefully than the woman coming down the hill. That little boy rolled up on the tips of his sneakers. He stuck his arms out and he flew through the air, a mini Superman, and suddenly he wrapped his arms around Ruby's neck, his legs around her torso, and down they went. I slid the last 2 feet on my knees. Oh, God, please. Not sure which of them I was more worried about. But when I looked around, I started to laugh. He was holding her neck and kissing her. Boofada! Kiss, boofada! Kiss. Her ears, her muzzle, her nose, her mouth, her neck. Boofada! Boofada! Kiss, kiss, kiss. She was licking as good as she was getting kissed anytime she could actually get her tongue out of her mouth enough to do it. By now, the woman had sunk down on her knees next to us, and she was crying. Oh, no, she's fine. I said, don't worry, he's fine, and she's fine. No harm done. You don't understand, she said. We've wanted David to get a dog for so long, and he's always been afraid of them. And look at this. He's been so afraid. We thought if he had a dog as a friend when he went to school, then if the kids made fun of him, it wouldn't be so bad for him. I took a closer look. David had Down syndrome. I understood exactly what she meant. One of my sisters had challenges so visible to the outside world, it made it easy for them to make fun of her. Well, he doesn't seem to be afraid of this dog, I said. And so Laura, which was her name, and David and Ruby and I sat on that grass for quite some time that afternoon, for hours. And I taught David every single command that I had taught Ruby. I taught him how to make her lie down and sit and roll over and high five and shake. He was brilliant. It's actually really easy to work with kids with Down syndrome. They tend to be a little black and white, and so he got it down perfectly, and Ruby responded to him as if she'd been working with him forever. And I talked to Laura about what it took to train a dog like Ruby. And then it was time to say goodbye. And so Ruby and I got into the car and rolled down the windows. Before we pulled away, Laura, what does boofada mean? Oh, Laura said, it means beautiful dog. Boofada, beautiful dog, 2 words I never thought I'd heard him say. Bye, David. Bye, Laura. Boofada. Boofada. And so Ruby and I headed back east. About a year later, I got a phone call from Laura, who I hadn't been expecting to hear from. We'd exchanged numbers, but it hadn't really seemed likely we'd stay in touch. They had, in fact, gotten a dog. They'd gotten not a puppy, which would have been way too much for somebody who was, when I met her, close to 8 months pregnant. They'd gotten a mature dog. They'd gone to a trainer. They'd had school every day with the dog. David had taught her all the commands I had taught him and more. He'd even taught her to pick up toys. Oh, and David was the most popular boy in his kindergarten class because he was the only 5-year-old who could make his very own full-grown Doberman lie down, sit, roll over, high five, and shake hands. Boofada.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.